reasons. Okay. One reason being his tenure at that particular time, but there was also information that has been around for a while because of one reason being that there was a pamphlet written around 1907 that talked about his services every Saturday to the slaves of the Hampton plantation. He also officiated weddings there. And then after the war, he left Baltimore the year the Civil War ended. So that really has piqued the curiosity of myself and others about, well, what does this mean about Mr. Galbraith and about ourselves? Why was he doing that? And what can we learn about ourselves? So a character that is important to this fact is Eliza Ridgely. Eliza Ridgely inherited the Hampton plantation through marriage, and it was at a time where the wealth of the plantation was really declining, but her wealth, bringing her wealth into the marriage, allowed them to increase the slave holdings in order to maintain the property. And she hired Robert Galbraith to administer services to the slaves every Saturday, and 200 slaves would gather in this building here, the second floor of this building here. And interestingly, she also fired him for marrying a woman suspected of having African blood. So this increased and piques the interest further. This scandal at the time, and what does this all mean about who Mr. Galbraith was, and what does that mean for Govans? What was his pastoral relationship with the slaves? What were the norms of the times in imparting religious services to slaves? Is there evidence that Mr. Galbraith rose above his times? And who was Elizabeth Love, who is the woman he married? How does this reflect on the history of Govans Presbyterian and our culpability in institutional racism? So I set out to answer these questions as best I could. And a major obstacle is the fact that we have none of his writings. We have none of the records. We had a tragic fire at some point in our history that burned a lot of our archives. So in order to understand who he was and who we were, we really had to look at a lot of other information. He arrived in Baltimore in 1849, and at that time, Baltimore's attitudes about race and slavery were mixed. Our population was actually very diverse. There were free blacks, there were slaves, there were native-born whites, and there were German and Irish immigrants. Baltimore was actually known and stood out as an exception of many large cities as to the content of our population in that regard. So when Mr. Galbraith came to Baltimore, he faced a culture that was grappling with morality and the divergent political views of pro and anti-slavery forces. So how would he engage then? Where was he coming from? Who was he? So I looked at ancestry, his family life, his education, his training in seminary, and his pastoral experience to try to understand these questions. So his ancestry is Scots Irish. And this is important not just for him, but to understand a lot about Presbyterianism and the Scots Irish immigration.
Oops, wrong one. Myra, sorry, I muted you by mistake. Myra, I'm sorry.
She's still muted.
There we go.
Okay. You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So here's a map of the immigration from of the Scots Irish, and the important line here is the green one, and that came from Ulster, and it was a huge influx from Ulster to Philadelphia, Newcastle, and Chester that then went first west and south, And Galbraith, our Mr. Galbraith, might be a third or fourth generation, I'm not sure which. His grandfather was actually a lawyer in Pittsburgh, so that's way over here. And his father was a minister in the Pennsylvania frontier. Okay, I'm trying to move my screen. There we go. Okay, so who were the Scots Irish? They were virtually all Presbyterian. And I'm going to read this quote because it's a very complicated situation that I have a hard time summarizing in my own words, but this person said it very well. British monarchs set forces in motion, and they continue. So James the Fourth had a scheme whereby he sent Scottish to Ireland, in a scheme that was supposed to help him to manage the Scotland better than he was able to at the time. But in doing that, the continuing deterioration of economic conditions in the form of poor harvests, slumping linen sales, and rising rents and tithes, and the unstable religious conditions in Ulster, which is this part of Ireland, Northern Ireland, pushed these transplanted Scots and their children to look for new opportunities and a better life in the New World in the early 18th century. So we have these Scots from this area here that were sent by James IV to Northern Ireland. Situations deteriorated and massive migrations came to the United States. This strongly influenced the U.S., and it was really the genesis of Presbyterianism in the United States. Now, just before that mass migration, and this is a little bit of a divergence here, but a fellow named Francis Makemie had actually been hired from Ireland, and he was Scots Irish. So just to clarify that term Scots Irish, it means these people were from Scotland, sent to Ireland, and then immigrated to the United States, but just the term Scots Irish. Makemie was known to be the founder of the American Presbyterianism. He was called to Rehoboth Plantation in 1683, organized the first U.S. Presbytery, and financed the ministry with business in Barbados, which is interesting to our investigations here. Barbados, of course, industry in Barbados, I couldn't find a lot about it, but anybody who knows about industry Barbados knows that that means he made money off of slavery, the slavery industry in Barbados. He married into a plantation. This business in Barbados really financed his ministry. And the will at his death in 1708 was the distribution of 30 chattel slaves. So this is just to give you an idea of the environment that the Scots Irish found themselves in colonial Pennsylvania frontier. The Quakers and William Penn, made a deal with the Indians, of course, the Native Americans, which, for better or worse, created an environment that was challenging as far as the frontier moving westward. And William Penn and managers of the colony actually fully embraced the idea of the Scots Irish moving west to open the frontier. And the Scots Irish were looking for land. They actually were a mix of people as far as class goes. There were educated and there were poor, mixture of different talents. And they played a major role in settling the western frontier of Pennsylvania. Of course, I feel like we should lift up a little bit since we're talking about racism, that it was not limited to slavery, but Pennsylvania came to be, but also was a tarnished vision in regard to Native Americans, of course, displacing them. Came to be a landscape utterly dominated by Euro-Americans who managed to turn the region's history not only into a story solely about themselves, but a morality tale about their best, being William Penn, and their worst, the Paxton Boys, which was a tragedy where rabble-rousers had murdered a lot of Native Americans. The construction of Pennsylvania on Native ground was also the construction of a racial order for the nation. So this is a slide that shows the patterns of populations, and here we have the Scotch Irish and in the dark orange, a mixture of Germans here, German settlement, the mixture of Germans and Scotch Irish in the hash, and then the tan is German settlements. And below I see one of our more famous Daniel Boone, who's actually going south and into Kentucky, but I think it's a nice illustration of the kind of people that were settling. So what were the Scots Irish attitudes towards slavery? Well, you can't really sum it up in one statement. Like many things, it was very diverse socioeconomically. And his grandfather was Robert Galbraith, was actually a lawyer and one of the first to be admitted to the bar. And he was a leader in Pittsburgh and helped found the University of Pittsburgh. So like many populations, the whether you had slaves or not was an economic decision, and to own slaves was actually a sign of upward mobility. So Robert Galbraith, while he was not involved in the plantation industry, he did own 2 slaves. They probably were house slaves, and it was partly an indication of his social status that he had that. So an important part of the Scots Irish ancestry was religion and education. The churches were at the center of most of these communities. Education was highly valued, and Presbyterianism has been known and marks itself as a religion that actually requires college educated to be at the pulpit, unlike many of the other Christian churches in the U.S. So his dad, James, was a pastor in the remote parts of Pennsylvania, which I find kind of interesting. So he came from a family who was the grandfather was a lawyer in Pittsburgh, and yet the father then, James, moved more eastward into the center and rural parts of the state to become a minister. And in Hollidaysburg, there were just a few houses and a tavern located on a narrow dirt road, bringing an occasional pack train of horses. Here, Robert received a classical education and learned to read and write in an old schoolhouse on the banks of the Juniata. So this is a 1756 map that shows Pennsylvania, and on the left is where Pittsburgh was formed, and the Juniata River is here. And you can see it would be hard navigating and great getting around in those days. So one of the things that influenced Mr. Galbraith's environment was the gradual abolition of slavery that occurred in Pennsylvania. This was an act 30 years prior to his birth in 1780, abolishing slavery in the course the first act of abolishing slavery, and it prohibited the importation of slaves into the state. All children born in Pennsylvania were free persons, and those enslaved before 1780 remained slaves for life. So at that point in time, when you were born, you were a free person. If you were enslaved, you remained slave for life. So this was their gradual way of abolishing slavery. And it became a model, actually, for freeing slaves in other parts of the North. So what was his exposure to slavery in Pennsylvania then? Mr. Galbraith was not a part of his family life. It was not a presence in the community. In 1810, which is a year before his birth, there were 23,000 blacks in Pennsylvania, and only 3% of those were enslaved. In 1820, when he was about 9 years old, there were 40 African Americans in Hollidaysburg, and most of all of these people were free blacks. So there was a mention of his dad, Mr. Galbraith, the minister, as having what was colloquial known as the minister's hotel, which was a way of saying that other ministers who passed through the area would stop there, and there would be a lot of a discussion. So what were the conversations he might have had listening at the dinner table? And one conversation certainly was the PCUSA grappling with slavery. You know, it was there were a lot of people that were Presbyterians at that point in time. It was a truly national denomination in the 18th century up to this into the Civil War. And Presbyterians encompassed a wide range of viewpoints on slavery. Prominent leaders in the church were slaveholders, moderate anti-slavery advocates, and abolitionists. So there were a whole range of opinions within the church. And this is a diagram of the history of Presbyterianism, and all the points of convergence and divergence are when different factions of the church came together and fell apart. And it's a very complex web to try to understand. So PCUSA in the decade leading into the Civil War was in many ways no different than the country as a whole. Compared to some Protestant religions, such as the Quakers and Methodists, Presbyterianism fell way short of asserting a moral authority against slavery. And similarly, Baltimore Presbytery reflected the same conflicts of the citizenry in the state of Maryland. And while different factions of the Presbyterian Church had different opinions, and they were grappling and struggling with the issue of slavery, the church leaders at the top really valued unity over schism. And in trying to have a unified guiding principles, they really compromised their value. They compromised over their principles. Compromise unity over principle. So 1818, there is some writing which was taken as the opinion of the church for many, many years, and it was written by Ashbel Green. He was the president of the Princeton University, who owned a slave, and he reported to the General Assembly. At that time, Robert would have been about 7 years old. And this opinion was cited as the opinion of the church for decades. It called out the moral evil of the institution, but it did not demand its demise. A quote is that the duty indispensably incumbent on all Christians to labor for its complete extinction. But that was just a platitude in the statement. They went on to outline a range of compromises that fell way short of that end. Here's Mr. Green. And in fact, he expressed sympathy with the supposed paradox of slavery. And his quote is, "The number of slaves, their ignorance, and their vicious habits generally render an immediate and universal emancipation inconsistent alike with the safety and happiness of the master and the slave." So, uniformly, the church seemed to recognize that there was a moral problem with slavery, but anything short of that was pretty embarrassing. Under that, it was pretty embarrassing. So, in 1830, Galbraith leaves home to go to college. And he went to Jefferson College, which was founded by Presbyterians. The reason we have the log cabin here is that there's some mythology with the Presbyterian colleges, that there were 3 log cabin colleges that eventually merged together. And the merging of those 3 colleges is now the current day Washington Jefferson College. And these colleges were all started by the College of New Jersey, which is present-day Princeton University, to spread Presbyterianism to the western frontier of Pennsylvania. So another major influence then for Mr. Galbraith was Princeton, where he received his training. When he was 26 years old, he went to seminary or received his degree from Princeton in 1837. Princeton was the first seminary founded by the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, and he was said to be a scholar and a gentleman. It was established in 1812 while slavery was still legal. And at the time where he graduated, Princeton was transitioning from a more liberal orientation and social reform to conservatism, which became known as Old School Presbyterianism. And around the time that he graduated, there was actually a split in the church. The Old School and the New School split into two separate churches. So while Old School and New School may just sound like a descriptor of philosophy, they were actually two churches, the Old School Church, Presbyterian Church, and the New School Presbyterian Church. And Princeton Seminary aligned around the Old School. So Princeton was entangled with slavery. They did profess, similar to the religion, to long for a day when slaves would all be free. But it was, on the other hand, not condemned in the Bible, according to their beliefs. And Princeton believed that abolitionists who called slaveholders sinners were actually fanatics. Many of the faculty played key roles in the formation of the American Colonization Society, which is the society that wanted to, as a solution to the, quote, slave problem, to send them all back to Africa, to Liberia. And it was a major center of that support. Individuals were complicit as slaveholders. And of course, they participated in a larger culture that was entangled in the effects of the slave trade. So Princeton has been doing a lot of self-examination, and in the Princeton Slavery Project, it was summed up that in many cases, their personal views on slavery, while sometimes difficult to discern, reflect a fundamental contradiction between expressions of condemnation of the institution on the one hand, and reticence to call for its immediate and radical abolition on the other. Another way I like to think about it is that I think Presbyterians, being intellectual, many of them, I think, had a hard time imagining the pragmatics of abolition. So Galbraith, as a graduate of Princeton, so what does this mean about him as a person? While you might be tempted to assume that this is a reflection on what he may have believed, many of the graduates departed with the attitudes of the faculty. So, I imagine this as young people and old people. Young graduates often are a little bit different than some of the members of an institution. Some of the graduates became abolitionists. One of the members of the class lost his life in that fight. So we don't know, but while Galbraith was complicit in benefiting from the slavery through the education he received at Princeton, as Princeton was, we cannot assume that he was complacent of or supported the institution of slavery upon his departure. So here's the schism of the 1837 Old School and New School. There were differences in doctrine and attitudes about revivalism and slavery. Old School Presbyterians were sympathetic to slaveholders. They felt anti-abolition was divisive and unchristian in their methods. And they also believed in the verbal infallibility of the Bible and other conservative views, whereas the New School was opposed to slavery, supported abolition, and believed that people had free will to choose salvation. And this is Albert Finney on the right, representing the New School, and Princeton on the left, representing the Old School. So where did Galbraith align then? We don't know, but we know that after he left Princeton, being prevented by ill health from fulfill. This is a quote from a publication. He had wanted to go to India and being prevented by ill health from fulfilling the long cherished design of going to India. He turned his attention to Africa as it was found at home and devoted much attention both to preaching to the Negroes and to their instruction in Sabbath school. So, what was happening in the way of preaching to the Negro, and what does that tell us? Well, going back a little bit, there was a major character, Samuel Davis, during the Awakening. He was Princeton's fourth president, so we're going back a little bit, a decade before, or a century before Galbraith here. But he was a pioneering Presbyterian minister on Virginia's Piedmont. He preached the spiritual equality of Africans and African Americans and supported the education of enslaved people. He preached in a warmly evangelical fashion. He was particularly interested in ministering to slaves, championed literacy, never questioned the legitimacy of human bondage, and never questioned, however, the legitimacy of human bondage, and owned slaves himself in Virginia. So a complicated man there. So the First and Second Awakening was a time where more liberal views about religion were espoused, and there was a very personal relationship with God, and a lot of camps and revivals happening. And at that time, large numbers of slaves found the biblical message of spiritual equality before God appealing and started participating and found comfort in the biblical theme of deliverance. Converting to Christianity became a part of accepting America as home. This is one point of view. Unfortunately, after the Awakening, a century later, things radically began to change in Virginia. And some of that was as a result of some slave rebellions, including the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831. In response to that, Virginians became very fearful, and the law then started to require a white minister for worship. And some began to believe that a Christianized slave would be an obedient slave, and started seeing religion as a way of controlling slaves. Others, on the other hand, seemed to believe the importance of providing salvation to those in bondage, ironically enough. And then the presence of abolitionists was sometimes a motivation of the Southern Church to evangelize to slaves. A little bit of a conflict there. So Galbraith then went to Virginia and preached and taught slaves and possibly free blacks in Brunswick, Virginia in 1844 in this climate. He had a wife, Mary, and a 4-year-old son. And in Brunswick, Virginia, there was chattel slavery. Tobacco was in decline, and they were selling slaves south. In 1850, there were 70,000 slaves held by Presbyterians nationwide. 1/3 of the Presbyterian ministers had slaves, and 1/2 of the members of the Presbyterian in the church on the South owned slaves. So at that time, there was a character, Charles Callcott Jones, and he wrote a long dissertation, The Religious Instruction of the Negro. I struggled with whether to give a lot of credence to this book, not because it wasn't important, but because it's not clear whether Galbraith was influenced by this particular orientation or not. And we don't know, but I would make an argument that we can't assume he was. This was published 1 year after his arrival in Brunswick, Virginia. He was a Presbyterian minister and slave owner. However, major differences between him and the background of Mr. Galbraith was that Mr. Colcott grew up on a plantation in Georgia. He then became a minister and attended 3 different seminaries in the North, including Princeton. For 20 years, he served as a missionary, a pastor, and a professor at Columbia Seminary. And after that, he returned to the plantations to direct the plantations and also evangelize the slaves. He had a very clearly a sinister agenda, however. And again, this happened after the slave rebellions in Virginia, and happened in the context of a time of a lot of fear of what that might mean. And he felt that there would be a better understanding by instructing the Negro, there will be a better understanding of the mutual relations between master and servant. There'd be a greater subordination and a decrease of crime amongst the Negroes. Much unpleasant discipline will be saved to the churches. The church and society at large will be benefited. The souls of our servants will be saved, and, importantly, obedience will never be felt and performed to the extent that we desire it, unless we can bottom it on religious principle. It will be noticed that obedience is inculcated as a Christian duty, binding the servants, and thus the authority of masters is supported by considerations drawn from eternity. So he felt that it was by the permission of Almighty God in his inscrutable providence over the affairs of men that the Negroes were taken from Africa and transported to these shores. Being brought here, they were brought as slaves in the providence of God. We were constituted masters, superiors, and constituted their guardians. And all the laws in relation to them, civilly, socially, and religiously considered, were framed by ourselves. They thus were placed under our control, and not exclusively for our benefit, but for theirs also. So, pretty shameful attitudes. So where did Galbraith align? So we can compare these 2 men and try to place them in a context, and we really don't know. But if you look at Mr. Colcott, he grew up on a Georgia plantation. He was introduced to slavery from infancy, and he returned to the South to a plantation he inherited. Mr. Galbraith, on the other hand, grew up in rural Pennsylvania. He had no slavery in his family environment, and he may have heard arguments about its immorality from a young age. So, was Galbraith more evolved? He could have been, we don't know. There were words that we do have from another Princeton graduate, which was William B. Stewart. He was actually the second pastor of Govans, and he was you could argue that he was more similar in background. He had a degree at Washington College. He was Scots Irish descent. He was a Princeton graduate, and he sermonized in 1862 in strong support of the Union. So this is just, a contrasting character that may have been closer in his background to Mr. Galbraith than Mr. Colcott. So meanwhile, back in Govanstown, while Galbraith was in Virginia preaching to the Negroes, we had 3. Pardon?
I just say, meanwhile, back at the farm.
Right. We had 3 trustees set out to build a church: Henry Turnbull, William Govain Howard, and Edward S. Myers. Henry Turnbull was a wealthy man, and he was the major benefactor. He was the owner of Auburn House, which is still at Towson University. And this is a contemporary picture of the Auburn House. He married wife Anne Graeme in 1838, and he actually acquired his wealth through marriage. So Anne's father's wealth came through banking and the insurance industries, and the value of their estate was $20,000 in 1850, which would be about $700,000 in today's money. Who were these people? Well, the Turnbulls were Southern sympathizers. And at the time that they were involved with Govans, census shows that they had one middle-aged female slave and later two slave teen girls. By 1860, no slaves were shown in the census. Their son was a Confederate soldier and died in 1863 from diphtheria at the age of 24. After the war, we know that Mr. Turnbull actually Turnbull left Govans and joined the Washington Southern Presbyterian Church. On the right, you see an article that was written, and in the article, it talks about Lieutenant Turnbull was buried in Harrisonburg, said to be buried facing north so that when he rose, he would be facing the enemy. So William Govain Howard was a trustee, and he was a descendant of William Govain, the Scottish immigrant who had a land grant for Govans in the Govans area from Lord Baltimore. It's unclear if his ancestors ever had a plantation. I tried to make that discernment, but it is clear that later in time the land was divided up and ultimately became Govans. William Govain's father and mother are buried in the Govans Cemetery graveyard. They were actually disinterred from Drumcastle. He was employed in agriculture, and through that industry, he owned 6 slaves, aged ranging from 10 years old to 35. Edward S. Myers lived in Laurelville. He was a farmer. His personal estate was worth $10,000. There was no records that he had slaves, but there were 2 black servants listed in the census. So from that information, what we can discern is that our founders were complicit. They participated in keeping men, women, and children in bondage, accumulating wealth at their expense, and therefore contributing this wealth to the building of our church. By extension, our church was built on the backs of slave labor, even if the hands of those laborers did not directly place the stones of our walls. So the other thing to realize is there were attitudes that were supported by our founders, and even though they were not plantation owners per se with, hundreds of slaves, the economy and everything else that went on at that time, along with their sympathies, were means that our founders were complicit in the institution of slavery and in thereby systemic racism. I'm going to start with the Turnbulls because we're running out of time. There is a lot more to say, but the Turnbull children stayed even though the parents left. I could not find information about their sympathies. However, I think we can assume that there was a division in the family that maybe had broken down amongst the generations. And so the children did stay. And they were then responsible for really expanding the physical plant of the church. Ellen built the chapel for Sunday school classes in memory of her mother. And the chapel would be then what the building that is south of our sanctuary and has the stained glass within it. And now, our education building winds around it. But originally it was a chapel for Sunday school. And then Lawrence financed the 2 transepts, the chancel and the tower. So major expansion of the church funded by Mr. Lawrence. So this is just the tip of the iceberg in our complicity with institutional racism. And there's a lot of information to follow, interesting information to follow, but I think this is probably a good place to stop.
All right.
Any questions?
Thanks very much.
Good job.
Well done. Nicely done, Myra.
Thanks, Adam, for your comments. I didn't read that. Would anybody like to, I don't know if Adam, you want to read your comment, or if anybody's got questions before we head over to the service in a couple minutes?
Sure. First of all, Myra, you killed it today. Good job. This has been, and I've seen your research over the past several months and over the past couple of years, and this is just amazing. And you know, I really do appreciate you taking the time and the trouble out of your schedule to kind of pull this together about our beginnings and about where we're coming from and where our complicity with racism just lies. You know, and as for my comments, I said and you brought this up, Myra, that it's interesting how slaveholders like Ashbel Green, even from the very beginning, used the whole ignorance and savagery of Black people as this paternal reason to improve them by enslaving them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just the whole idea was, well, our wealth is based on slaves, so we can't get rid of that. So how do we rationalize that into a system that we can live with? And so this was, as you also said, Myra, Presbyterians pride themselves on their educations. So they twisted themselves into knots trying to figure out how to theologically take, you know, breaking the chains of sin and death. And meanwhile, you got to get your butt back to the plantation, get out there and hoe, you know, because we own you. So yeah, it's good to see that a lot of this, you know, you showed that a lot of the racism that we see that's even in the church is baked into the theology of our denomination, and it's still there. And it's going to be all of us working to get rid of it. And it's going to be understanding our history to do that. And you helped us with that today, Myra. So kudos. Well done. Thanks again.
Thank you.
As a quick advertisement, Professor Yu from let's see, a seminary in Georgia will be visiting us in the 26th and 27th of March to talk more about the history of the church and institutional racism. But other questions or comments for Myra? If not, let's thank her again, and I think we'll be seeing more. The committee is just partway through its work, and of course, you didn't tell us about you know, what happened to Galbraith and how he wound up having to leave town, and the employ of Hampton and so forth. That's a story to be continued.
Yes, it's all there in my presentation. Yet to come.
Can I also say that I would be so interested in just hearing about your process of finding and learning about all of these?
That's a great idea. I would love to have the three committees, Adam, of yours, Leah's, and Julie's committee come visit sometime over the next couple of months to talk about the process and the goals and where we're going from here.
So Myra, I just want to mention how I loved you incorporating the stained glass from the church into your presentation. And you know, there's a lot of historical markers around the church. It would be very interesting to hear how that all ties together. We see those. Most of us have no idea who those people are or how they fit into the picture. So I think that's very interesting, and I would love to see more of that as you go along. That was really helpful.
Let me just say also that the way that you said that, you know, even though those slaves did not put those stones in our church, we're still living on the backs of that labor. I thought that was very well said. Okay, I'm done.
So let's go to church.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
more to come.
Terrific, Myra.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Well done.
Look forward to,
I was afraid nobody would come, so
Ah,
thank you.
everybody loves history.
Yeah, the time's weird.
You did good, Myra. Thanks.
And you'll have to tell me how you got those eyebrows. I like them.
I have no idea. They're gone.
I am not a
All
cat.
right, bye now.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Ben, was Galbraith one of the pastors that founded the church?
Yeah, he was so he was the third pastor. He was here from the mid-1850s to 1865, for about 12 years. And he also preached at Hampton House. I don't know, if Hampton Plantation?
Yes.
I don't know if you ever spent any time there.
Yep.
But there's, in the main hall of the plantation, there's a huge portrait of a woman